I did a speech at PAX where I was talking about how I got started as a creator and how my parents encouraged me to create from whatever was around. And then when I was 9, we had an Atari 2600, we got one for Christmas. At that point I decided I want to make games, but I had no understanding of what it took. A year later, we got an Apple II, and all of a sudden, the tools were there. So when I started Insomniac, my goal was to make a console game, and more specifically, something that was a lot like Doom, because I'd been playing a hell of a lot of Doom, and I was so enamored by that game. And that interest was shared by Al Hastings, who was the first person to come on board after I started Insomniac, and then his brother, Brian Hastings, who came on board after we had done our first demo. And all three of us really loved the idea of making a first-person shooter. And we learned a lot from playing Doom, but then we wanted to take it further with our own take on really cool weapons and these psionic abilities that we would give you as a player. We didn't know what we didn't know. That was what was so much fun. It was just a big adventure, and we were either going to succeed or fail grandly. What I remember most about Disruptor are the cutscenes that we created.
If you can survive the Lightstorm training, you will bear the awesome responsibility of defending global democracy throughout the regions of space.
I shouldn't say we, because we were working with Universal, and one of the benefits of working with Universal is they have a lot of TV production folks at their disposal. And we had an interesting choice to make at the beginning of production, and that was, do we tell a story with renders, which were incredibly expensive at the time because we couldn't do it in an engine, or do we go out and film real actors on real sets telling the story? And so because we were working with Universal, we thought, well, it makes much more sense to record real actors. So with some help of some outside folks, we wrote a script, and we went down to studios, I think on Santa Monica, and recorded these really, really cheesy cutscenes.
You don't have the brain power to outmaneuver a few droids with attitude. I never forgive myself for sending you on a real mission. Just remember, think fast, shoot fast, and kick ass.
And I guess in some ways that lent a certain charm to Disruptor, this sort of quirkiness that set it apart from other first-person shooters. But I remember being on the set and having things falling off the walls and looking at our so-called teleporter, which was basically a cardboard or wood prop, and thinking, oh my God, that doesn't look anything like what I imagine a teleporter to look like. But we just went with it. Now remember too, at the time, that was in vogue for games. Warhawk was a good example.
There wasn't enough of them left to fill a Boy Scout troop. Creel's forces didn't even flinch.
And we were looking at that and going, oh, that's pretty cool. We could do that, never realizing that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of expertise to do it. And I gotta give the actors credit. I mean, the story itself was where everything started, and we were not the experts in terms of writing story at the time. And they put a lot of heart into it. And I think it shows. I mean, but it's still really funny to watch those performances and just think, wow, at the time we thought this was kind of cool. And it wasn't.
All the psionics in the world couldn't have saved him from that terrorist ambush.
That was the last video that we ever tried to use to tell story. After Disruptor, there were about 5 of us in the Insomniac office, and it was all of us in one small office working together, and we were trying to figure out what to do. And we were pretty sure that we didn't want to do another first-person shooter, certainly not another dark game, because Disruptor had taken a lot out of us. Our first game, we'd gone through a lot of ups and downs, learned a lot, but also needed a break. 3 things happened in particular that led to Spyro. The first was that Mark Cerny, our producer, came to us and said, you know what guys, there seems to be a real vacuum in the market because Nintendo is making family-friendly games that are succeeding wildly, but there's nothing on the PlayStation that's appealing to families. You guys should consider changing your approach and doing something that's more family-friendly. And at about the same time, one of our artists, Craig Stitt, said, hey, let's make a game about dragons. That would be really cool. And for those of us who have been focused on Disruptor for the last several years, it was kind of like a light bulb went off because we were thinking, hey, fantasy, less hardcore than what we were doing before, this could be really fun. And the third thing that happened was that Al Hastings had been building a brand new engine for the PlayStation that focused on panoramic views and ways to be clever about LOD systems to create the illusion of these large environments. Because we were talking about a dragon who could glide and could run fast, that worked really well when it came to what we could do with that engine. And the idea of a cute dragon that had a universal appeal worked with what Mark suggested. So that's really how Spyro came to be. When Mario 64 came out, it was a huge hit in our very small office. And I remember we had a Nintendo 64 and we played incessantly through the first level. We spent most of our time in that first little environment where you can run around in circles and climb trees and jump. And I remember Brian Hastings, who's our chief creative officer and did a lot of the controls, all the controls in camera for our first several games. I remember him dissecting it piece by piece and pointing out that if it's fun to run around in circles, then it's a win. And so he focused heavily on making sure that Spyro had that same toy factor. Those are his words, toy factor. And what ended up happening was the game was fun before we even put in enemies. Because it was fun to run Spyro around in circles and we got the charge working and it was fun to kill enemies with the flame and knock them over with the charge. But it wasn't until we added that third dimension with gliding that suddenly I thought, wow, this is different. This goes beyond other platformers out there and other mascot type characters that exist on platforms, because you can just simply do more with this character. The gliding levels were an interesting challenge because we spent a lot of time with the controls and trying to figure out whether or not we wanted it to be a true flying level where you have complete 6 degrees of freedom or constrain it in some way. And I think that took a lot of internal testing to figure out that sweet spot where you feel like you can do anything, but in reality, we're constraining things. So it feels good, but we're not letting you get frustrated. It also opened up a lot more gameplay possibilities for us in terms of design. And I think that variety that Spyro has in its levels and in terms of what we ask players to do is something that does make it special, certainly for games of that era. Our animator and modeler at the time, Alain Mandron, who's a French guy, had this really quirky sense of humor, and he'd stick whatever the hell he wanted to in the game. I remember being surprised all the time by what showed up. I mean, we had some really wacky stuff in Spyro because there were no rules. We created a universe that didn't have any specific rules. It was a universe that was a complete fantasy place. It wasn't tied to reality, and there were no constraints with story, constraints on characters, and in some cases, it got pretty weird. And we did some really weird stuff in Spyro just because we could and because we weren't satisfied with using the same approach to enemies. Well, there was one character I think that has bats coming out of his stomach, so his stomach opens up and bats fly out and attack you. I remember that was probably the pinnacle of weirdness for us. And then we had crystal bears in one of our levels. I think it was crystal bears, it was crystal something. It was just weird. And that had to do with everybody contributing and just coming up with the ideas that kind of sort of fit in the world, but provided something different for players. For me, the most memorable feedback was the feedback we got on Spyro's personality.
Where's Nasty Nork? I'll torch him.
And I remember reading comments from people who complained about the fact that he was a cocky bastard. And that wasn't, I don't remember that being our intent, but when we did the voice recording and when we were figuring out who he really is, he just kind of came out as a entitled little jerk.
Bring him on. I think I smell a barbecue.
Some people liked it, and it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so for subsequent games, we wrote Spyro to be a softer, more likable character, and the voice acting reflected that. And I don't know if that helped or hurt, but that's who he is today. Or at least that's who I remember him as, is the more friendly Spyro versus that sort of the kid that really annoyed the hell out of you.
Looks like I've got some things to do.
We're gamers, first and foremost, and we want to play games that offer something different with every new game that we bring into our homes, whether it's a sequel or a brand new IP. So we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, even with those early games, to constantly reinvent whatever it is we were building at the time.